Today, we will be talking about the Sean Goldman case. Imagine finding the person of your dreams. You fall in love with them, get married, and have a son. You finally get the family that you've been wanting, but everything changes in one day. This is the abduction story of Sean Goldman. On December 17th of 1999, Bruna Bianchi and David Goldman get married. They are happily in love, and there are no signs of anything being wrong in their relationship. Both parties seem happy, and both parties are in agreement. In the year 2000, the happy couple had their baby boy, Sean Goldman. He grew up with Bruna and David for 4 years in the United States. As you can see with the picture on the right, this is a pretty normal family. Yet everything changed on June 16th, 2004. On this day, David dropped off Bruna, Sean, and her parents off at the airport for a 2-week visit back to Bruna's home in Brazil. Unknowing to Sean, Bruna would not come back to the United States. She would file for divorce and take Sean away from David, leading to a grueling custody battle. This battle lasted for years, with Sean now growing up in Brazil away from his biological father, David. To make matters even more complicated, Bruna remarried a family lawyer in Brazil, got pregnant with her daughter, but unfortunately died during childbirth. Even after Bruna's death, it wasn't so easy for David to get Sean back. Sean's stepfather was now attempting to gain full custody of Sean and trying to erase David from the picture. One of the main questions of this case is this an actual abduction case? Most oftentimes when we think about abduction cases, we think of an old man in a white van luring a child with candy. Yet, most oftentimes, abduction cases are usually involving someone that the child is very close to, such as a parent or another close family member. So even though Sean was with his mother in Brazil, this is still considered an abduction case, because Bruna took away Sean from David, which violated his custody rights as his biological father. Family abduction is defined as the taking, retention, or concealment of a child by a parent, other family member, or their agent in derogation of the custody rights, including visitation rights of another parent or family member. So, Bruna taking Sean away from David was an absolute violation of David's rights. It is also important to understand the Hague Convention Treaty when talking about this case. According to the U.S. Department of State, the Hague Convention Treaty is an international treaty that aims to return children who were abducted back to their home country. This treaty protects the child from international abduction in countries who do not recognize U.S. court orders. So many times people will try to take a child to a different country in hopes of finding a loophole from U.S. court orders, but this treaty protects children against this. It is also important to know what qualifies the case to be protected by the Hague Convention Treaty. For the Hague Convention Treaty to work, you must first prove 1. That the child is a habitual resident of one convention country, 2. That the removal to or retention in another convention country was wrongful and violated custody rights. And lastly, that you were exercising or would have been exercising your custodial rights if they were never taken away.
Facts and arguments. So the relevant facts for the case. On June 26, 2004, David drove Sean, Bruna, and Bruna's parents to the airport for a planned 2-week vacation to Brazil. When Bruna arrived to Brazil, she had called David and told him that the marriage was over and that she and Sean were never to return to the U.S. and he would permanently live with her. David argued that he had been tricked and did not give Bruna consent to remove his son permanently from the U.S. He did, however, give consent for the 2-week vacation, but not to have Sean permanently removed from his life. So for the 4+ years Sean was legally retained in Brazil, which was according to the Hague Treaty, the Brazilian courts had ignored orders to have Sean return to the U.S., and they also ruled full custody in the Brazilian eyes of the law that Sean belonged to his mother, stating that it is the most important bond. And To say this is that Brazilian courts always tend to rule in favor of the mother. Bruna obtained a divorce from David in the eyes of Brazil, but not in the U.S., and then Bruna had remarried Juan Paulo Lins L. Silvia and became pregnant. She did, however, pass away, unfortunately, in childbirth in August of 2008. So there is no other legal reason Sean should have remained in Brazil for as long as he did after his mother's death. Paulo did not file for custody, but filed to replace David on the birth certificate issued in Brazil for Sean. He argued that since Bruna had custody of Sean, it should transfer right to him since he was his guardian, and Sean had acclimated and enjoyed Brazil. However, his appeals to keep Sean in his life as his primary caregiver was denied, as in December 2009, a Brazilian chief judge ordered Sean's return to the U.S., which was successful. So David's arguments, he's the plaintiff. So their court argument was that Brazil violated the Hague Convention Treaty because Sean had been illegally retained in Brazil, which had violated the treaty that both countries, meaning the Brazil and the U.S., had signed. So Sean was considered abducted. He was considered abducted twice, actually. Once at the original when Bruna took him, and then when Paulo tried to make himself his sole guardian after Bruna died, he was technically abducted twice because it was two different circumstances. The next major one they did was denial of parental rights. So David in the U.S. still had full parental rights of Sean when he was abducted in the 4+ years he was in Brazil. When Bruna died, Sean should have immediately been returned to the U.S. to David, but he did not get that, which violated his parental rights even more. And then a third one they did was the child's best interest. Sean had been wrongfully separated from his father for 4+ years. This prolonged separation caused emotional and psychological harm to Sean, seeing as when they reunite in Brazil was a very emotional time. The defendant's arguments. There are many different defendant arguments based on the original court cases from 2004 and the ones that kept happening in 2008 all the way into 2009, but these three were the ones that kind of stuck. So they also did the best interest of the child. So Sean had been fully integrated into Brazilian culture. He went to school there, he had friends, and they stated removing him would cause trauma. Since he was taken when he was 4, they also claimed he had no memories of the U.S. or his father since he was so young, and Sean had established emotional bonds with the family down there. However, we did see that when he did meet his father a few years after he'd been taken, there was an emotional attachment to his father. They also argue that David did give alleged consent. So David did not take the most immediate action to get Sean back because it was a few days after Bruna got to Brazil and told him they were never coming back. And they also argued David allowed time to pass before pursuing his case under the Hague Convention because originally he just went through the New Jersey state courts and didn't put it under the Hague Convention first. And then they also argued that legal custody should be ruled under Brazil. This is mainly used after Bruna's death. Paulo was granted full custody of Sean in Brazil, arguing that he had been acting as Sean's guardian since Bruna died, and they leaned heavily on Brazilian family law for their arguments, and they ignored all U.S. family law because it would not favor in their side.
For the legal discussion portion of this presentation, I will be discussing how previous rulings may have affected the case, legal discussions presented by both parties, and a court decision, including the summary of the ruling and key points from the majority and the dissent. There were 3 main cases that affected this case, or previous rulings that affected this case. Those include the Hague Convention Treaty, divorce law in Brazil, as well as divorce law in New Jersey. According to the Hague Convention Treaty, a child may only remain in another country under due authorization of the parents who exercise legal custody. In Sean Goldman's case, this would mean that his only other living parent that would have legal custody would be his father, David Goldman, in which he should be returned to in the United States according to the Hague Convention Treaty. The main purpose of this treaty is to ensure that custody decisions are made by the courts in the country where a child originally lived, meaning that court decisions should have been made in the United States, not Brazil. Divorce law in Brazil states that it will only recognize an American marriage as legal for divorce if both parties are living in the country in which they are seeking divorce, meaning that Sean Goldman's mother should not have been granted divorce from David Goldman and should not have been able to marry her second husband, who was a Brazilian lawyer. There is also no treaty in Brazil that requires the U.S. to uphold international divorces from any country that can be recognized by states on comity. This is a case called Hilton versus Guyot, meaning that the U.S. would not have recognized Sean Goldman's mother's divorce from David Goldman. New Jersey divorce law only recognizes a foreign divorce as legal if at least one person is living in the foreign country and the spouse must be given sufficient notice. That portion of the clause is called the right to be heard. It also falls under due process, meaning that David Goldman should have been given sufficient notice before his wife was granted a divorce, which did not occur. There's only one main argument argued by both sides. In fact, it was the Hague Convention Treaty from both sides. David Goldman and his lawyer were arguing the main clause of the Hague Convention Treaty, which was that legal proceedings should be made in the country in which the child originally lived. De Silva, which was Sean Goldman's mother's second husband, who was the Brazilian lawyer, he argued a different clause of the Hague Convention Treaty that stated a child is to stay in the country they have moved to if they've adjusted to their new environment. Ultimately, the court decided that David should be granted custody of Sean, but legal proceedings continued for many, many years. The court did rule based on the Hague Convention Treaty from David Goldman and his lawyer's point of view of the Hague Convention Treaty. The dissent again argued that Sean had acclimated to his new environment. However, the majority said Sean should be returned to his father as he's the only other living biological parent, which is another clause in the Hague Convention Treaty.
In analyzing the decision, the central legal framework was the Hague Convention on the Civil Aspects of International Child Abduction, and this was discussed in a previous slide. The courts had to decide whether Brazil had the obligation to return Sean to the United States. Under the convention, the standard is whether there was a wrongful retention, and it was clear that Sean's removal violated his father's custody rights in the United States. Although Brazilian courts initially delayed their return, arguing that Sean had adapted to life in Brazil, the Hague Convention requires that exceptions like this be applied narrowly. The Brazilian Supreme Court ultimately ruled that the treaty obligations must be enforced, prioritizing Sean's habitual residence and parental rights over subjective arguments about his adjustment. This decision reinforced the principle that international law must be respected even in the most emotionally complex cases. The decision had several major implications. Legally, it showed that the Hague Convention is only as strong as the willingness of the countries who enforce it, quickly and consistently. Politically, it led to significant diplomatic tensions between the U.S. and Brazil. But most importantly, it resulted in new legislation, the Sean and David Goldman International Child Abduction Prevention and Return Act of 2014. This law empowered U.S. government to take real action against countries that fail to return abducted children, strengthening the enforcement of international treaties. So this case directly led to stronger protections for future families who are facing similar situations. As for the societal and real-world impact, this case had extensive media coverage, which helped increase the public awareness about child abduction internationally. Beyond the legal world, for Sean Goldman, the year-long separation from his father caused deep emotional trauma. He had to adjust not only to a new home, but also to new culture and relationship with a parent he barely remembered, all while being in the public eye. For David Goldman, the experience turned him into a public advocate. He fought tirelessly not just for his son, but also for other parents facing international abduction. Societally, the case raised public awareness about the emotional cost of international custody battles and led to stronger legal protections. It made it clear that international child abduction isn't just a legal issue, it's a human issue. Thanks to this case, the world now takes these situations far more seriously. And here are our references. Thank you.